now reached the 20th century, and we have, I'll record two more videos, one of them devoted to Matisse and other artists who use color um, in exaggerated ways to express emotional content, and then a final video on Picasso with an emphasis on Cubism, a style that, at least in its beginnings, was aimed at an analysis of artistic form, the form of the objects represented. So let's look at some images by Matisse. Matisse lived a long life. There we go. From 1869 to 1954. And initially he trained as a lawyer, and he was working as a law clerk when he came down with a serious illness, which led him to stay at home. He returned to his parents' home. And during that time, his mother purchased for him a paint-by-number set. And so his entree into the making of art was through paint by number, which involves simply filling in the spaces of a drawing with colors, either of your choice or according to a numerical scheme which is given to you. He apparently very much enjoyed this, and he signed the images Esatem, which is Matisse backwards. Well, soon he decided to relinquish the career in law and devote himself to art. He studied in Paris under Gustave Moreau, and eventually, as something of a latecomer, he established himself as an artist, working independently there around the age of 30. In 1905, he participated in an exhibition with an avant-garde group of artists. They exhibited their works at what was called the Salon d'Automne. This was the third such exhibition of the Autumn Salon. And it was at this occasion that the group got its name from a critic who came into the room full of brightly colored, savagely colored paintings, and seeing a work of Renaissance sculpture in the center of the room. He said, Donatello au milieu des fauves, Donatello in the middle of the wild beasts. And so it was from that phrase that the name Fauvism came into being, the name for the group. They were the wild beasts, and individually they were fauves. This was one of the works that was exhibited, a small portrait by Matisse. It is 15 by 12 inches in size, roughly 16 by 15, I guess, to round it up. And I'm showing you this in replacement of the brightly colored portrait, which is in your textbook, of a single female figure. That one called The Woman with a Hat. We can see a similar use of bright, subjective color and really vigorous, one might say even crude brushwork. But you'll notice there is a color scheme here which centers around the green stripe, which is the title of the work. It's subtitled, by the way, Madame Matisse. And if we look on one side of this green stripe, we see that the face has a pinkish hue. If you look on the other side, it's yellowish with green shadows. Here another green shadow. The lips are pink. The background then on one side is green, on the other side it is red, and a variant of red up here. And we see these same colors juxtaposed in the blouse that she wears. So what you begin to realize is that the painting is based around the complementary contrast of red and green. These are opposite colors. They have the effect of intensifying one another when put side by side, as he has done throughout this image, even in small details. So you notice that, for example, against the green background, the ear has a pinkish hue, whereas the ear has a greenish hue on the other side of the face against the red background. In addition to the expressivity of the color, which is intense and aggressive. The brushwork is very sketch-like, rather crude one, rough one might say in places, particularly near the garden, with the little decorative strokes, decorative marks put on as single strokes, rather randomly, loosely applied. So we see here in this small work, this early work by Matisse, we see him using color in bold ways for the aim of expressing something about his subject. In this case, a portrait, a bust-length portrait. So in terms of subject matter and presentation, he looks straight at us, blank background, nothing, no objects in the background. The image conforms to long-standing conventions of portraiture, but the way it's painted is very different. And one might say that the frontal pose of the face, where she looks intensely at us, is then intensified through all the various elements of form that I've discussed. Now, instead of discussing the work in your textbook, an interior scene called the Red Room, I'm going to show you here the Red Studio, which dates from 1911, a work which is 6 feet by 7 feet. So we're looking in both cases at rooms with color used subjectively. This is Matisse's own studio, it seems, because I look around and I can recognize paintings in his style, for example, here, and even objects, decorative objects that he used repeatedly in paintings. But you'll notice the entire room, floor, walls, even the furniture, chair here, a table, are painted red. And then drawn lines are applied over the top of this red, which suggests the space of the room and the form of objects. So, for example, the table seems to recede to get narrower as it moves away from us into distant space. There is a line here which separates floor from wall, and the various objects that are delineated or shown in greater detail conform to that division. So we've got a lot of paintings that seem to lean against the wall. Interestingly, there is no division here between a wall that runs in this direction and the one that would be 90 degrees in relation to it. So, taken together, these things give us, on the one hand, a strong affirmation of the flat plane of the canvas, which is colored red without gradations, without modulation. And that stands in contrast to the drawn forms, which indicate depth of space. So two-dimensionality sort of fights with three-dimensionality in a way that's interesting. It's visually exciting. Now, why would he use this color? Because this is the studio, a place of artistic ferment, a place of creative imagination and creative production. I think the red here symbolizes the heat of creativity and the passion he feels for art and what he produces in this space. Here's a work that's not in your textbook, but is a little bit later, and this is called, no surprise, The Dance. This is one of a pair of murals that Matisse created, and he shows us here 5 dancers. Notice that they are not specific to any time or place. They wear no clothing that would relate them to a particular part of the world, a regional tradition, a time in history. So there's a universal quality to their identity and also to what they do in all different traditions. Cultural traditions, people have danced to celebrate rites of passage, changes of season and the like. So there's something raw and direct about this. And I want to contrast it with another painting of dancing, which comes from an earlier period in history. If I showed you this as an unknown painting, which I sometimes do on exams, not this year, but sometimes I prepare students to do this, and I might ask them then to associate their work with a style period or with an artist as closely as possible. And I would hope that you might identify this as a Baroque period painting. It's the work of Nicolas Poussin. It's an example of Baroque classicism. And what we see here are various figures and objects which represent the passage of time. For example, this is Father Time over here, the winged figure who plays um, on a stringed instrument. And notice the two little cherubs in the foreground. One is blowing soap bubbles, which signify transience, um, the ephemerality of time, which passes by second by second, minute by minute, hour by hour. We can't stop it. We're forced to adapt to it. And the other child holds an hourglass. Apollo passes overhead in his chariot, changing night to day. In front of him, Aurora sprinkles flowers over the ground. You can see the darkness recedes, and light follows Apollo across the sky. This is a Janus figure, the Roman god of passages, with a youthful face that looks into the future and an aged face that looks into the past. And the figures, then dancing in the center, turned outward toward us, they signify states of human experience. That is, poverty and luxury, labor, and what's the fourth one? Let's see. Labor and luxury, and wealth and poverty. Those would be the two opposites. So the male figure back here is labor. This is wealth with the gold coins in her hair. Luxury adjacent, and then poverty. Very simply dressed woman. Well, these are states of human experience that unfold in time. Occasionally our circumstances change, and we may actually change states and go from, say, poverty to wealth. But that rarely happens, particularly in the Baroque period. At any rate, this is a painting that is, it's an allegory. There are many things here that symbolize ideas, and we have to put them all together to figure out the meaning of the painting. But it really requires a learned viewer who has a knowledge of these conventional symbols that are used. Whereas Matisse's painting requires none of that previous knowledge. It is direct. It communicates in a simple, more emotional way. We might feel the energy of the dance. There's a gap between the hands here that would seem to invite us to join in, to fill in that space. And notice his artistic language. It's really, really stripped down. He uses really only three colors. That is this sort of brick red color, as well as the green and blue. I'm going to call the hair then the darker color and the lines simply a variant of this the brick red color. You call it a fourth color if you want. You notice that throughout there are curved crescent or arc-shaped lines, which we see in the details of the body. Here, the buttocks, notice the details of the back, the shoulder, but also the larger shapes of the body. And the ground is made of the same shape. That is a series of arcs or curved, crescent-shaped curves. So the artistic means here is extremely simple. And you notice that this kind of orange-red color means that you have against it a near complementary contrast. Orange is the complementary of blue, and red is the complementary of green. So we have a near contrast down here and a more exact contrast, with the effect that the colors intensify one another. We could say this is an example of primitivism. You know, a kind of stripping away of the intellectual baggage of a painting like this, going back to essentials and showing human beings doing something that has its roots in the earliest human experience, and is stripped of any sort of details that would limit it to time, a specific time and place. The painting has a pendant or a companion painting, and that is seen over here. That's called music, and you can see that the formal devices used here are very similar. Late in life, Matisse became ill. His physical capacities were limited, and he spent a lot of time in bed or in a wheelchair. And it said that he was unable to paint. I don't know why you could sit in a wheelchair and paint, but what he did was to develop a new medium. He had studio assistants, like the woman right here, paint large sheets of paper with gouache. Now, gouache is an opaque watercolor, and it produces really rich, saturated colors. Matisse then would take these sheets of paper and with a pair of scissors simply cut out shapes. So this is called cutout technique. He was literally sculpting with color by cutting out shapes out of single colored, purely colored sheets of paper. And then he would have the studio assistants pin them to the wall and move them around until a larger composition emerged that he found satisfying. Then they would be glued down to a background. He began doing this in creating illustrations for books, so he's working on a relatively small scale. And then the process got larger and larger and larger so that entire walls were filled with cutouts. And here is an example. You'll notice that we can see the same kind of shapes that you see right here. And I don't know the relation between this specific relationship, whether what we see in the next slide is actually, these very same cutouts put down, or the image that was to emerge from them. But certainly they're very similar. We have here leaf-like or maybe coral-like shapes glued down against a white background. Notice that they have a variety of brilliant orange, red, green, blue colors. Here is a detail of an exhibition that I had to see a few years ago at the the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. It was devoted to his cutouts. And you can see the number of these works are quite large, but he worked, as I said, on various scales. And so I want to show you up close. Here is an image of one of several he did of female figures posed in different ways. In this case, a blue nude dancing, dating from 1952, so almost 50 years after the portrait displayed in the Salon de l'Automne. Well, his artistic tools could not be simpler. All we see is simply a blue shape against a white background. And this would have been cut out, probably a number of pieces which were then put together, cut out of sheets of paper covered with this blue gouache. And I think the resulting image is really exciting, really quite gorgeous. We see a nude figure in profile. A single breast is visible. You can see here clearly an arm in this case. This might be either an arm or it could be her hair. It's readable as both. This definitely hair. The upper part of the spine and the legs. Certain things, hands, feet are left off, no need for them. This form alone suggests the energy and the joy, the dynamism of a female figure dancing in space. Matisse then was sick again, and he went through a long period of recuperation, where he was cared for, at which time he was cared for by Dominican nuns. And as an expression of thanks for their care, he decided to build a chapel, and I think he may have paid for it himself. It's small. And to design everything about the chapel, right down to the vestments worn by priests and the liturgical objects on the altar. So this is the building right here. It's called the Matisse Chapel in Vence, V-E-N-C-E, in the south of France, not far from the Mediterranean Sea. A blue pattern on its roof. The roof of a very simple rectangular building. And inside you can see stained glass windows that he designed. Here an image of Madonna and Child drawn very simply onto tiles on the wall. And here a Dominican priest by the altar. The windows are his own design, and with light passing through the color, they have, I think, a particular brilliance. And then here is another view. I see we have seats running in two different directions, and that would be to distinguish between the nuns that lived here who would sit over here, visually separate from the lay community which would occupy the seats in this area, the foreground. And here's an example then of one of the vestments, a chasuble designed for a priest. And what we're looking at here is the model for the work which was to be then sewn in fabrics, made of fabrics, but it was a cutout technique that he used to create this design with a cross of an interesting shape on a rich red field. It is, of all the post-impressionists, it's the art of Gauguin, the art of Van Gogh, I think to a lesser degree Gauguin, but primarily Van Gogh, that inspired the lavish, intense, expressive use of color by the Fauve painters and Matisse really throughout his life. And we can call this a variant of Expressionism. That is a deviation from naturalism. No longer is anything limited by the appearance of objects in the world around us. Color is used intensely, subjectively, and forcibly in order to express emotional content. And that same urge can be seen in artists working in other places, especially Germany. So I want to show you in conclusion a few examples of German Expressionism. There were a number of avant-garde groups that formed in Germany. Typically, they had limited duration and might last 10 years at the most. And then they would break up and the painters would realign in some other way. One of these groups was Die Brücke, the word meaning the bridge. And Die Brücke formed in Dresden. One of the members of that group was Ernst Kirchner. And we're looking at work which is in your textbook entitled A Street in Dresden, dating from 1908. Now, the title tells us, and we can recognize generally what's going on here. We're looking at a whole lot of pedestrians in a busy city, walking in a couple of different directions on the city street. But you'll notice that Kirchner is not at all limited to plausibility, to familiar experience of the world around us. He has rendered the figures in very simplified, somewhat coarse shapes. He's given them highly exaggerated colors, and the figures themselves have rather ghoulish, mask-like faces. He seems to be expressing here his anxiety, his negative reaction to the crowd, and perhaps the limitations, the conventions, the force of conventions that he feels from the people among which he lives. The street is painted a brilliant pink color with obvious dabs of a deeper pink in painterly technique. And we've got strong color combinations elsewhere, particularly brilliant reds. Another Dresden painter of note is Emil Nolde. Nolde was interested in religious subject matter, but he portrayed familiar stories from the Bible in novel ways. This is Mary among the Egyptians. And I want to show you, because we can compare this with other works that we've already studied, this is his version of the Last Supper. What could be more different from Leonardo's Last Supper, which you see on the right-hand side, than the street lit by Nolde? Gone is the perspectival space, which contains a lot of symbolism, if you'll recall, the trees and the fours and the wall panels and the windows, the implied halo. Well, gone is all that. Rather sophisticated subject matter. Remember, Leonardo divides the figures into groups of four groups of three figures. The number symbolism runs throughout. The figures show a variety of poses as they respond to Christ's announcement that one of them would betray him. In contrast, Nolde shows us a group of figures closely clustered together, And this seems to be not a moment of anxiety, not a moment of soul searching, but a moment of celebration, of conviviality, of togetherness. Uh, they clasp arms around each other, as you can see here. This looks like hands held together. They're close together. They feel a sense of commonality, of common purpose. The brushwork is rough, and coarse, and painterly, and the colors of red and also green dominate, complementaries that will intensify one. Another group of note that painted in a variant of Expressionism was one in Munich, which is called Der Blaue Reiter, the Blue Rider, formed in part by Vasily Kandinsky. And Kandinsky is given credit for creating the first wholly abstract paintings. And this is a possibility that he conceived in seeing Monet's Haystacks, works uh, that come pretty close to abstraction themselves. Uh, Apparently, Kandinsky thought, why must we refer to subject matter at all? And so, many of these paintings he gave musical titles. This is an improvisation. Let me remind myself, yeah, number 28, improvisation number 28, War. And we see a lot of shapes that are layered over the top of one another. Um, a variety of colors, no identifiable objects that one can see. Sometimes these paintings do suggest something, but very obliquely. This is a work entitled Concert. I think it's Impression number 3, yes, Concert. And one might possibly see the big black shape as a piano, and in front, other areas of color that suggest listeners. Uh, Perhaps the yellow is the stage. But that's all um, very remote. Um, if this is a painting that speaks primarily with a formal language of strong colors, strong value contrast, and shapes that are largely abstract, perhaps only minimally suggestive. All right, so that's the extent to which I will cover these movements in the direction of expressionism, and I'll follow this with a final video on Picasso and the various styles that he explored during his career.